Hello, poopheads and sexy people. How are you doing? I am a dork. Thank you for asking. I mean, good. Good, yeah. So, I am back for another visual podcast slash speed paint. This was a long time coming because my microphone was acting like a moron. So I had a lot of trouble deciding on a topic to talk about because, if I'm being honest with you, I'm very weird when it comes to social media. I'm not very good at it, if I'm being honest. And I'm over here thinking, oh, should I make a podcast while I'm doing a speed paint and have the podcast be about a particular speed paint? Well, with this particular project I'm working on, I will be drawing a lot of furries. But ironically, I'm not actually very engaged in the furry community. So all I had to say about furries was probably everything I had to say about furries in the last video. So let me just say this. I'm not a particularly popular person because most of my interests align outside of what is popular or, widespreadly liked. Widespreadly is totally a word. I've always loved opera and old Hollywood, and I like really problematic movies like Pocahontas or recently Gone with the Wind. It's actually a good movie, as well as also being a terrible movie, but no one likes to talk about those things. So I realized very quickly that around a time of like maybe 6 months ago or less, I started getting very invested into killing stalking after actually avoiding it for quite a while. And I realized pretty quickly that after I liked it so much to get a sweatshirt of it, that wow, I'm a popular kid now. I've only just graduated college, but I'm finally here. Liking the popular thing. Semi-popular thing, anyway. And of course, since I read that and Painter in the Night, another Korean webcomic slash manhwa, and of course I have 8 million thoughts about each of them. Now, I'm not trying to bring them up because I'm trying to compare them, although that was probably inevitable because everyone else seems to be doing that, but more just because they're popular and they have elements that I normally just do not see in anime or anime adjacent stuff. I'm sure eventually there will be a new word for Korean manhwa because it's not as widespread enough just yet to really be its own recognized thing apart from Japan. But we'll just go with that. I'm going to be really real with you. I am kind of a bitch when it comes to animation, or I used to be. I've seen every Studio Ghibli movie under the sun, but it wasn't always like that. I was actually very pretentious against anime because I was so used to the rotoscoped feel of Disney animation and it looks so realistic, some of it, not all of it. And I was just so petty against anime because I just thought, oh my god, it looks so lazy. And on some level, I did end up biting my own tongue because the thing that anime is probably most known for that people have grievances with is the same face syndrome. And as we've seen with Disney, is that they are also guilty of this in every movie since Tangled a decade ago. But I think the thing that I really love about Disney is also the thing I seem to love in these manhwas. Of course I'm talking about the style, the very faithful to real anatomy type of style that's also extremely emotive. One of the things that made me fall in love with Disney is after watching Pocahontas at a young age, I was mesmerized by the hair, but I was also mesmerized, especially more now as an adult, the attention to real anatomy. Now, Killing Stalking by Kugi and Painter in the Night by Beyond Duck, I think that's how you call her, kind of make the characters in Pocahontas look like stick figures in comparison. But I also do have some qualms about the style, but we'll get to that in a minute. But first, why did I want to talk about these comics in the first place? And there's a lot to think about with either work. And whenever I watch a movie, whenever I read a manhwa, if it's popular enough, of course I'm also interested in other people's opinions of it to refine my own. I know that sounds kind of like follower, not leader, but I do find it pretty interesting because people can just pick up things that I can't. So in the case of both Killing Stalking and Painter in the Night, There are two great reviews here on YouTube by James Somerton. Check it out. I really recommend it. But here's the thing. And this will almost undoubtedly come up in future videos, but I am extremely hypercritical of anything relating to gay media. Because not only is it kind of all that we as a community have as a means of seeking out mirror images of ourselves in popular culture or anywhere really, but the fact that most of it, and these are no exception, are created by heterosexual authors and heterosexual ideas of what gay life is like, of course 99% of the time it really freaking sucks. And, people that know me know how hypercritical I am, so it's probably kind of a shock that I would be at all invested in killing stalking. I was actually, matter of fact, avoiding killing stalking for years. All I knew was that, oh wow, the main character looks really good in glasses. But it's funny, because I had actually had a discussion when I first talked about this with anyone that led to a very lengthy conversation about age gaps and how they can be potentially dangerous, age gap relationships. And oh, that was not a fun conversation at all. Actually, it was quite stressful. But no one is more surprised than myself that I would go anywhere near a 10-foot pole with killing stalking. It has pretty much all the elements that make me very worried about who is going to be affected by this representation. As you can tell by now, I'm going to tackle killing stalking first, and then I'm going to tackle Painter in the Night, because that's just the way I'm going to do things here. So, for those of you who don't know, Killing Stalking is a Korean manhwa, that was created in 2016 and ended syndication in 2019 by a company called Lezhin Comics. And from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, I think that is the comic that ended up skyrocketing that website and that company into kind of mainstream recognition. Because it did seem to kind of take the world by storm. And for good reason, honestly. Like, it is a very well-crafted story. The only thing you really need to know about it, if you don't want it to be spoiled for you, is the fact that it's about a killer and a stalker. Not a very, clever name, but okay, it probably sounds better in Korean. It's about a very abused, very obviously troubled young man, a 28-year-old named Yoon-bum, who falls in love with this guy that he has not really met, but he kind of met. And it all spurred from him being saved from a attack, I have to be careful with what I say here on YouTube, in the Korean military, because military service is compulsory over there. And he was saved by this man named Song-woo. Song-woo is established as being quite popular and quite lovable, and everyone seemed to like him because he's so charismatic, and he went to the same university that Yoon-bum had. And Yoon-bum is set up to be quite the opposite. He's not younger, as is normally the case, than Song-woo, but he is definitely on the weaker, more malnourished side. He's maybe a bit more childish, or maybe just timid. And so far, this just sounds like your typical yaoi anime stuff, right? It kind of sounds like what you would expect from boys' love genre of Japan, if you are familiar with it. However, it's almost comical how that gets turned on its head and becomes this big twist that when Yoon-bum's obsession becomes enough to actually break into his house, he finds out that he is, well, a serial killer. And there's a woman in the basement that had clearly been attacked and assaulted. Song-woo finds out that he has been broken into and is about to kill Yoon-bum until, that is, Yoon-bum made himself very, very valuable to Song-woo, declaring his love for him and implying his obedience. And Song-woo, of course, being a narcissist, a psychopath, probably a sociopath, sees this and utilizes it to the fullest extent. So, Killing Stalking is about the relationship between two very severely mentally ill people who form some type of codependent / relationship with each other. And I use relationship very loosely and not necessarily in a romantic sense. and kind of seeing these vastly different personalities take shape in these very, very unconventional scenarios. And it is actually really interesting. And that is going to be the end of the spoiler-free section. I'm not going to run through the plot of the story since it's so heavy and there's so much detail. And I'm assuming if you're watching this video, and probably only 5 people will at the absolute most, you probably already know what's going on and you're probably a killing stalking aficionado. I am going to be discussing this comic in terms of the stuff that I'm concerned with and the stuff that I actually think it does well. First, I do want to preface this section of the podcast by telling you some of the things that make me really hate a lot of gay media and see if that applies to killing stalking. One, and I feel like I'm one of the only people that actually care about this, I really hate it when heterosexual people are the primary creators of gay media, especially actors. And since I'm supposed to expect that Coogie is one of the only hands on deck in the creation of this novel, at least the bulk of it, and we know that she is a woman. We don't know what her orientation is, and frankly, it's none of our business. But regardless, she still would not have any understanding of the gay male experience. So there's that. I also really hate movies where the characters are not very likable or even admirable, and this unfortunately is true for most live-action gay movies. Like, I really hated Holding the Man for this reason. I also really hated In God's Own Country for this reason. But unlike killing stalking, horrible personality and bad decision-making actually does get called out, even if it doesn't get rectified. I also am going to admit to being a bit of a prude and say that the hypersexualization of gay people in media has always been probably my biggest bitch. And lastly, I think I've really gotten tired of seeing this trend of movies about gay people seeming to exist in either just one of two binaries. Either they are super hypersexualized, or they're very, very sad and mopey, because a lot of movies I just kind of end up referring to as like the sad lesbian movie, or the sad gay movie. Or, a third category, just simply being boring as hell. Obviously, that third one does not apply to killing stalking. So, with all of that being said, I want to get to it. What do I like about killing stalking? Well, a lot of things actually. I really do actually like the story. If you are someone that is into psychological horror, if you are someone that you consider to be very analytical in your thinking, and you love reading and watching things that make you think, especially if you have a history of enjoying true crime or anything that is a bit more morbid and macabre, you will like this. I didn't really have much of an issue getting through the story because I'm not personally triggered by things like abuse, assault, emotional and psychological manipulation, but a lot of people are, and that's completely fine if you want to skip this video or skip killing stalking altogether. One of the things that makes this journey so fascinating is the fact that even though it's from the interviews that you can read with the writer of Killing Stalking, she almost implies that she had not actually done that much research into this particular dynamic or in the types of mental disorders that she has assigned to the characters, like borderline personality disorder, etc., etc. She does seem, from my inexperienced, unprofessional knowledge, seem to be very true. Her depiction of this in the characters rings really true. It doesn't seem half-assed or baked, but yet again, people may surely disagree with me on this. I also really appreciated the backstory that was done for both Yunbum and Sangwoo. And I know a lot of people will have issue with that, like, oh, we're not trying to be sympathetic to a literal sociopath, but it is very effective in conveying how someone might turn into something like that. Because both of the characters, Sangwoo and Yunbum, are victims of lifelong abuse and external circumstances, like the fact that Korea's mental health awareness or mental health practices are pretty freaking terrible. Like, one of the worst in the whole world. Sangwoo and Yunbum really do, kind of in a way like the movie There's Something We Need to Talk About, Kevin, where it really poses questions as to whether or not evil is born through nature or nurture. We don't know. I don't think it's a question that has a clear answer to it yet. And I'm very interested with the fact that Yunbum and Songwoo seem to exist on either side of that coin as to what happened to someone who had been victimized. Either, for a lot of experiences, it seems like it splits in two ways. When you can continue to be re-victimized over and over again because you're so used to it and that's what you know, or you can become the victimizer and enact that pain on other people. Frankly, it would be better if we all just learned better and moved on and learned to heal, but that is not what the story is, and it never tries to be that. More of what happens within the story involves a police officer who suspects Song-woo of murdering his own parent because he lived alone, and nobody believes him. His hunch is right, but he had no facts to go on. So the entire comic, in part, is about this one police officer named Sung-bae who knows something is up with Song-woo because left and right there's all these unsolved murders taking place that kind of lead to Song-woo possibly being the perpetrator. And Yunbum, who develops a codependency on Song-woo because his situation at home, where he's being abused sexually by his uncle, causes him to develop what I think is a very good depiction of Stockholm Syndrome, if we believe that such a thing exists, because some people don't. And I think it's a really effective way of describing Stockholm Syndrome in a fictional story, in a way that I think is easily understandable. Because unlike something like Beauty and the Beast, it makes more sense because he's so deprived of resources, and the resources that he does have are arguably a lot worse in his mind than what he is getting with Songwoo. Because the abuse that he faces at home is a bit different from what he gets with Songwoo. Part of Songwoo's manipulation and ability to keep Yunbum under his thumb is to sprinkle and pepper in his vicious assaults and verbal abuse with affection and kind word, because he knows that's a very good way to manipulate him. And this is what psychopaths and narcissists do. They prey on people who are vulnerable, who are deprived of resources. They can detect weaknesses like that and use them to construct an impossible situation to escape. Which is worse, going home and being abused by your uncle, or being abused by this man that you previously lusted after before all of this, who does abuse you in the same way your uncle does, but at least it's not totally bad because he's feeding me and cuddling me sometimes when he feels lonely. Basically, these people are using each other for their own physical and emotional needs. The story explores how a person can possibly react in these types of desperate circumstances. And I have no problem believing that if most of us are unlucky enough to have these circumstances, we probably behave exactly the way that Yunbum has and make the exact same decision. And by the end of the webcomic, which spans like 3 years of syndication, Song-woo does die, but it's implied that Yunbum does too. But that is the greatest tragedy of all. He seems to have, Yunbum, been able to at least try to understand that what he was feeling was not love for this man, but the confusion and emotional codependency that would come from being a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. So this might seem an odd way to segue into Painter in the Night, but I feel it's probably more appropriate to discuss briefly, and it's not going to be as lengthy of a description, Painter in the Night before I get into the stuff that I take issue with in both series, because the stuff I take issue with largely apply to both works. Painter in the Night has a reputation of being kind of like the dynamic of Yunbum and Song-woo, except 200 years ago. The main characters feature a noble named Sung-ho and a drunken painter named Nakyum. The story this time around is actually pretty straightforward, and there's not really a whole lot of psychological action taking place. It's just plain and simply this young boy Nakyum who is known for being a painter, but he paints erotic imagery, mostly sodomy, which basically just means gay sex. Sung-ho, on the other hand, is a noble who is riding out the last gasps of his estate that is in decline by living it up. He's smoking all this opium. He's hosting a bunch of gay orgies. It's just a fun time for him. So you have one person who is known for creating erotic imagery, and then you have another person who is known for his insatiable lust. And one of the ways he channeled that is apparently this admiration for this one person's art. So these characters gravitate to each other like magnets, and then attach like two parts of a puzzle piece. They're compatible in the same way of Yunbum's desire for any positive affection versus someone who is attracted to that trait to utilize it for their own predation. So what happens is that Sung-ho basically coerces, if not outright kidnaps Nakyum and forces him to become his little painter. And he ends up inviting him to his chambers to watch him getting it on with other men. That's supposed to be erotic for him, the nobleman, but Nakyum is over here actually quite humiliated. He gets humiliated throughout the entire comic series. There's very few scenes in the story where he is not in abject misery. And that's, again, the end of the spoiler-free section, although I guess I kind of already breached that territory, didn't I? As you might probably have guessed, of course this eventually escalates into Nakyum being used as a little plaything for this abusive rich man. And if you get far enough into the series, you'll find out that he basically admits that, verbatim. And to discuss the rest of this story, I feel like I need to bring up James Somerton again, because his video on this comic called The Statism of Class, he adds some extra definition to the story that either he interpreted in it or I just simply did not see. Unfortunately, when we're talking about rich people or more privileged or empowered people preying on underprivileged groups, what happens is the same as what always happens. Rape, despair, abuse, financial power, the lack of power, and how that lack of power ends up being weaponized against those that can do nothing to influence systems in any major way. Much like Yunbum in Killing Stalking, Nakyum is the point of view character. We see everything from his perspective, which does make it a bit more palatable to see someone just being completely taken advantage of and stripped away from his resources over and over again. But it still makes for a really difficult read, because like Yunbum, Nakyum is also a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, or at least some type of codependency, because he ends up finding himself submitting to Sung-ho's sexual advances. Because the thing I think that most people don't understand is that while we want people in abusive situations to be more empowered and to feel more confident to be able to leave their situation or stick up to their abusers, we don't talk enough about how sometimes sticking up for yourself can actually make the situation worse, especially if it means nothing more than just your catharsis, because not every escape attempt or every attempt at sticking up for yourself is going to lead to anything good for you. That is one of the horrors of abuse that almost never gets discussed. Almost never. And this is why on any type of discourse on anything on the internet is always maybe a little bit vapid. And I hope as much as we evolve into being more self-aware human beings, especially on the internet, we'll also evolve to looking at these issues from 2 sides, 3 sides, 4 sides to really get a clearer picture, because we're still figuring this out. But anyway, back to smutty Korean webcomics. Well, considering that this story doesn't have an ending yet because it's still ongoing, which is why the comparison between the two really don't make sense, I will just leave it at that. So now I'll just discuss the parts that I do like about this comic and what I don't like about both of them. Well, I really like the art style. Again, yes. The expressions, people don't give Kugi enough credit for the expressions in Killing Stalking, but they're actually really effective. And they're even more effective in Painter in the Night. You can really... Cartoon characters are never really allowed to have more than one visible emotion at the same time. It is possible to convey emotion that has several different layers in it. And despite the kind of typical anime-ish nature and dimensions of the characters' designs, she does do a lot with them beyond Duck, the creator of Painter in the Night. And if this really is a commentary on how people in the upper class abuse those in the lower class, she may really be tapping into something here. However, like Killing Stalking, although not as much with Killing Stalking, those are layers that you kind of have to dig under to find that stuff. And that is leading into one of the issues that I have with both of these works. And boy, I don't even know where to begin. There is a lot wrong with both of these works. Killing Stalking especially, it's hard to talk about the things that are quote unquote wrong or problematic because there's not, even a few years later, there's not an accepted, widely approved script of what is right and what isn't wrong with the story because there are so many different ways to interpret it in a way that's different from, say, whether Belle from Beauty and the Beast has Stockholm Syndrome or not, which is kind of cut and dry if you actually know what Stockholm Syndrome is. And it is not Beauty and the Beast. So to address my issues, I do want to refer back to the list in one of the previous sections of all the stuff that I normally dislike about gay media in general. Well, I think it's pretty safe to assume that gay people have had nothing to do with the creation of either of these works, and even if Coogie and Beyond Duck are lesbians or bi, they still don't come from a gay male experience, which is where these stories are supposedly coming from. Granted, neither of the stories really claim that this is about the quintessential gay experience or how it would operate in such and such circumstances, no matter how removed from our modern day reality they might be. But that adds a certain dimension of problematicness in anime and Korean manhwa and Asian media in general discussing the lives of gay people that is kind of specific to them, that sets itself apart from gay movies made by Hollywood in America. So we know that there is a massive market in Asia, particularly Korea and Japan, of fetishizing gay men. And there's virtually no mitigation for that. Like, hey, this actually might be kind of inappropriate. And not just about either of the works I'm discussing today, but in general. Because even a lot of the shitty representations of gay men here in America, a lot of that shit kind of slides to the wayside because I don't think gay men have ever been really encouraged to really critique the representation they get in the way that, say, black women do. Black women have been very good on the internet in terms of cultivating spaces and environments where they can commune and heal and really dissect the way that misogynoir affects them and the media contribute to, consume, or actively participate in. Side note, I'm actually really jealous of black women in this respect, because that type of community and rotation of conversation in black feminist spaces here on YouTube is something that is completely non-existent. So stuff keeps getting perpetuated over and over because there's not a whole lot of voices strong enough to mitigate that. Even other members of the queer community are gaslighting me and telling me I'm crazy because I have an issue with frickin' Jake Gyllenhaal playing a gay man. Or not even just him, but any straight actor. But in terms of Korea, and Japan particularly, why is there no serious communities and conversations about the very particular way that women have fetishized gay men? I mean, even think about it here in America. Producers in Hollywood know that they can't just make a movie just for gay people. That's supposedly such a small fraction of the movie-going public that they can't really justify making a movie about them unless there's another market that is interested. And with all of the female YouTubers, film commentators who are crying watching Love, Simon over and over again, really pushed home that the people who are watching these movies outside of the queer community are probably mostly allies that are female and usually heterosexual, which is fine, but that also translates pretty badly when it comes to not very good representations of gay men in movies and television and comics, because a lot of allies are going to assume that some of the more toxic behaviors or not so great stuff about gay representation, even if they might think, oh, that's a little weird, they might not say anything because they're afraid of being seen as homophobic, or that there's some nuance that they're not privy to. Because I've been there. I've been there and absolutely was in situations where it was like, oh my god, no, wait. I don't like when this group does this or that person from this group does this in the name of that group. But I keep my mouth shut because I know I'm not educated enough to speak on it. So I can't really blame straight women for feeling like they're in that position too and decide not to say anything. However, I'm a trans woman. And as a trans woman that has lived the existence of not only being perceived as a gay man, but still dealing with people still viewing me that way now, I can tell you that this stuff is not acceptable. And by this stuff, I'm talking about the very weird sexualization of gay people in media. And the way that it manifests, particularly in Killing, Stalking, and Painter in the Night, is that most of these scenes are not consensual. They are flat-out assault scenes. And in the case of Painter in the Night, it's almost the entirety of the goddamn story, which is why all of the stuff that I discussed with Painter in the Night is stuff that I think is mostly interpreted rather than something that is intentionally baked into the story, although I could be wrong, because there's a lot of sex in Painter in the Night, but not so much in Killing, Stalking. And almost all of the sex scenes are done and drawn and positioned in a way that is supposed to titillate the viewer. That is essentially the market that they are gearing themselves to. Girls that get off on two men in a relationship, romantically, sexually, or otherwise. And apparently it is a very, very lucrative market. But there's something a little insidious about this weird romanticization of abusive relationships. And, we've seen heterosexual pairings exhibit this all the time, but it is a bit more dangerous when it's with gay people because there's so fewer representations. I've had to relate to characters that are no different than porn stock characters because I didn't have the luxury of, for instance, heterosexual couple where you can relate to Bella and Edward from Twilight or Anastasia Steele and Christian Grey in 50 Shades of Grey, but you can also relate to Snow White and the Prince or Jack and Rose from Titanic. There's just a wider array of mirror images to take from and to what you would like to base your desires off of. And unfortunately, most of the representations and the mirror images of gay men that gay men can take from are usually this brand of hypersexual, sometimes sadistic, masculine male character juxtaposed to fragile, womanly, submissive characters. And let's get that out of the way first. I don't think that either of these works are trying to be an accurate representation of what a gay couple is supposed to be. They're pretty far removed from most people's reality. But even then, there's an air of, cluelessness to the fact that there's almost never any mention of condoms or any type of preventative measures for diseases. And with, Painter in the Night, it's somewhat understandable because I don't know if contraceptives were a thing back then. They might have. But it doesn't really make sense for Sang-woo to not protect himself when having sex with Yoonbum because, one, I'm pretty sure he would be, if he finds Yoonbum so disgusting, why would he not want to protect himself from, shit? And that's the other thing. Wouldn't it be a bit more realistic if there was any discussion on, the reality that you need to clean out yourself back there? Because that's an aspect that it almost never touched upon in any gay media, ever. Something that most of us that engage in anal sex kind of have to figure out on our own, and usually the hard way. Wouldn't it make sense, for example, for instance, Sang-woo is done and realizes that he has something not so very clean on his penis, and then gets mad at Yoonbum for that and, smacks him around or blames him or gaslights him into thinking, oh, this is your fault. That's actually kind of accurate, right? But there's none of that. There's none of that type of realism when it comes to actual gay sex. Also, I know that there's a very common trope of no lubricant, I don't know if that's the word I'm supposed to use here, as like a use of force and domination. Like, oh, I'm so badass, I don't need that shit. And it's always like horrible for the submissive partner. And even in stuff that is not supposed to be seen as assault, that's weirdly normalized. The person on the submissive end of things is not enjoying it at all. But it still doesn't make sense because the top, the seme and uke, meaning dominant and submissive in Japanese, I don't imagine it would be a fun time having sex for him without lubricant, right? Because you want that to go in smoothly. This is the kind of thing that just kind of drives me crazy, and it's not even scratching the tip of the iceberg as far as all the things that I do take issue with. It's pretty obvious that most of us should know that romanticizing assault is bad, so why does it keep getting made? And I'm being a hypocrite, and I totally know this about myself because I do enjoy these works for what they are, but I don't financially support them. And even though I'd like to see how they'd handle the end of Painter in the Night, if they just, for some reason, stop production because they got insufficient funds, partly because of me, I'm not going to be that upset about it. Because frankly, as much as I like the art, it doesn't need to exist in a story like this. And for the most part, it does seem like we as the viewer are supposed to take what is happening to the main characters as bad, but that does kind of get overshadowed by the overly gratuitous, the overly erotic, the repetitive sex scenes over and over again that signal different messages. Are we supposed to like this, or are we supposed to resent it? And obviously we know that you don't need to show abuse to know it's happening. Film does this very well all the time. So there's no excuse for if this really was all about the way these characters are abusive to each other, for that sex scene to be there the way it is. I think it's pretty clear that Painter in the Night is supposed to be a smut, but there is a bit of like a gray area with killing stalking in which it's not as prevalent, it's not as constant of a feature in the story. But when Kugi says this is not meant to be read as a romance, she didn't say it wasn't meant to be read as sexual, or even titillating. So yeah, we can say Kugi did not mean for the character to be positioned as romantic or sexual, but that doesn't jive well with the fact that her Twitter is filled with fan art of killing stalking characters being presented in a romantic way. She is trying to have her cake and eat it too. That's why I can't entirely get on the train of let's not blame Kugi. I don't wish any harm on her, and I do think that she made a good story, but I do think that she is still quite irresponsible in the way that she frames her work. But then again, it might also be a demand by the Lezhin company of, hey, you need to market it some way, so maybe make it a bit more spicy and sexier. I also want to touch briefly on the art style again, because much as I said I love it, I love how these works make me want to be a better artist. That is a huge part of the draw for these comics, because when I read them, I am inspired to become a better artist, inspired to learn how to draw hand better, inspired to learn how to render features better. I have screenshotted Song-woo and Sung-ho's face because they really captured expression that I want to be able to capture myself, my own drawings. However, there are some problems I have with the art style. One, I think it's a little weird to be so faithful to anatomy in the body, but then get weirdly cartoon in the faces. You know what I'm saying? It is a little jarring. And I'm mostly used to it, but if I were just going in cold and have never seen any piece of Japanese media in my life, it would be very jarring. It's not quite as jarring as like some other animes that I can think of that are guilty of this. But also, even with this faithfulness to human anatomy, it gets to the point where too much is too much, because we're not used to seeing all the nooks and crannies of the human body. So even when it's real, the fact that it's presented to us in such thick, not very varying line weight, it starts to look a little alien. Because even the most rotoscope Disney animation doesn't go that far with it. And even though I would have no problems getting with a man that looked either like Sung-ho or Sang-woo, I almost prefer them with their clothes on instead of when they're off. Because, again, the extreme attention to detail with their bodies, even though they look like super muscular, super roided up military men, they almost look about as emaciated as Yoonbum does because it's just too much. And even with the sex scenes, it's like, I'm still not sure if I'm supposed to be titillated by this or not. Like, I'm dry as a desert over here. Because you're trying to make me think that this is sexy, and it's like, I'm not really enjoying seeing every rib on his body. I'm not really enjoying seeing every dehydrated ab on his stomach. Like, it's not good for me. And the last thing I want to discuss is the fact that I'm worried about its reputation, the reputation of both of these works to the general public. American audiences' interpretation of these texts is going to be a bit different, I think, from what I understand about Korea, even though I'm not really an authority as a non-Korean person to really say that. But as far as America goes, I think we're all aware of the fetishization and the romanticization of the couple and the foolhardy belief or desire for these couples to actually work or be consensual, to be faithful, to be not toxic or dysfunctional in every sense of the word. There's no hope for these characters. They're not meant to be romantic. And in the case of Killing Stalking's Kugi, she even said as much, but even then, no one believes her, right? Because that is not what the message she's giving out when she is on her Twitter, in the drawing of the characters in certain situations. No. And I do hold Beyond Duck's feet to the fire as well. I don't wish any ill will on these women. But at the end of the day, it is people like this that end up making, ironically, the fetishization of gay men almost more insidious than the fetishization of gay women. Because even though women are not the patriarchy and don't benefit from the patriarchy, they are still essentially creating and perpetuating this narrative that gay men are just punching bags, that we should sadistically enjoy their abuse, enjoy their torment. Because one of the hardest things that I've had to deal with growing up, being perceived as a gay man, is the inevitability, both in media and how people react to me in real life, is that I am seen as someone not to be taken seriously. We are presented in a way that is as pathetic as humanly possible, making jokes about us, justifying abuse, justifying homophobia, and it honestly weighed on me pretty hard growing up. Because in many ways, being gay, a gay man, or a trans woman, you are essentially like people's punching bag. You are essentially America's punching bag in a very big way. There are so many scenarios that you can be set up to be degraded or counted out. So seeing a character like Yoonbum, who is seen as someone easy to take advantage of, and almost every malevolent male character in the story of Killing Stalking seems to have a fixation or desire to assault him in a sexual way because he is seen as dainty and fragile and puts up with people's shit. And even though I'm sure that's not the intention, it kind of translates the message that if you present that way, you are asking to be abused. I've heard this from teachers in school when I was being abused. Oh, you are asking to be abused. You are setting yourself up for bullying if you, for instance, talk about your interest in Disney princesses. If you talk feminine. If you cross your legs when you sit. Blah, 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 blah. And as far as the Korean side of things, I'm very disturbed at the notion that if they, like America was for the longest time and still probably is, believe that homosexuality is linked to either being pathetic and helpless to being a threat upon the community. Because in some cultures, people really do believe that gay men are a threat to society because, they will attack our women. No, it doesn't make sense. But Sangwoo does kind of fit that fear because he is a man that hates women enough to kill them and engages in homosexual tendencies with his victim. I feel like some pretty short-sighted people both in America and Korea could see something like Killing, Stalking, and Paint in the Night and kind of be vindicated in their fears that gay men are predatory, that they are inherently mentally ill, that being gay is a mental illness. Because I don't know many situations in either of these works, and probably most of yaoi, and I don't really, again, engage in anime that much, in which any stereotypes of these characters are being rejected or tossed out or questioned. I don't get the sense that Kugi or even Beyond Duck are homophobic or hate gay people, but that's the thing about fetishization. The object that is being fetishized is treated like that, an object, and can be very easily disposable if it doesn't do what you expect them to do. People who go after, say, Asian women, for instance, expect them to be submissive or quiet or demure, and if they're not that, then they're disposable. They don't do the thing that a lot of white men expect them to do. And even though I have no proof or even reason to believe that either Kugi or Beyond Duck are anything within these sentiments or feel these things, feel this way, it still makes me suspicious. It doesn't make me trust you as a person, although I'm sure I'll never meet either of these people. Because while I am glad that at least Killing, Stalking exists, I'm not really sure why certain aspects need to exist, and I'm not even sure at all if Painter in the Night needs to exist in general. And again, this shit is exacerbated by the reality that we don't really have any strong role models that are guiding us into the right direction in terms of what is considered to be, or what should be considered to be, acceptable representations of gay people, gay love, and gay sex. We're still doing the same things, more or less, than in the 90s, in many different ways. Even Love, Simon, that movie that every queer or heterosexual woman seems to love, is still part of the problem because you cast a straight man to play the gay guy that we're supposed to root for, and a queer black man to play the guy that we're supposed to be making fun of for most of the movie. And then even though we humanize him, he disappears after that, once he ceases to be useful. Like anything that is fetishized, he is disposable. He is not there where Simon is meant to kiss Blue at the top of the Ferris wheel. Anyway, I could literally go on talking about this for maybe another hour, but I'm gonna leave it here. I could do a part 2 of this if I feel there are any additional pieces of information that could stand on their own in a new video. But, yeah, I just wanted to draw some anime while talking about the Korean version of anime with y'all. I hope you enjoyed the speed paint, I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and for the record, if you like Killing, Stalking or Paint in the Night, I don't blame you at all. But I do hope that maybe you might be more critical of what you're watching if you are either queer or a straight woman engaging in this type of media. If I were blaming you, I would obviously be a hypocrite. If you made it to the end of the video, I am very, very grateful for that. Please like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and I will return to you soon. Good night, guys.